Milgram Experiment, Bobo Doll Experiment, MKUltra. In this video, we're going to dive into the world of young and unethical psychology. Get ready for some controversial psychological studies that pushes the ethical boundaries and reveals surprising truths about the human psyche. Let's get started. QKHILLTOP. QKHILLTOP was a cryptonym assigned in 1954 to a project to study Chinese communist brainwashing techniques and to develop interrogation techniques. By the end of the Korean War, 70% of the 7,000 US prisoners of the wars had signed confessions. 15% cooperated fully and only 5% steadfastly resisted confession or indoctrination. Dr. Wolf submitted a secret report to Director of his Central Intelligence, Allen Dulles, about communist methods of brainwashing. That was the start of these experiments. In 1954, the CIA started Project QKHILLTOP with Harold G. Wolf as the director. The project aimed to exploit the vulnerabilities of human cognition, emotions, and beliefs, turning them into potent tools of influence and control. These included, but were not limited to, imprisonment, deprivation, humiliation, torture, and hypnosis. That's tough. Once getting into the mind of the test subject, scientists start causing physical and mental harm, loss of the idea of real existence and personality. The horrifying experiment led to a number of tragic endings and long-term mental disabilities. The effort was absorbed into the MKUltra program and the QKHILLTOP cryptonym became obsolete. The Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology, later the Human Ecology Fund, was an outgrowth of the QKHILLTOP. While I was making the script for this video, I was reading all kinds of crazy stuff about MKUltra and their experiments. I found a declassified document from the CIA. If you're interested in a video about that, just let me know in the comments. I was rather scared and intrigued while reading it, just spent a whole lot of hours flipping through the documents. Let's move on to the next experiment. Milgram Experiment. Stanley Milgram, a psychologist at Yale University, was interested in researching how far people would go in obeying an instruction. If it involved harming another person, Milgram wanted to investigate whether Germans were particularly obedient to authority figures, as this was a common explanation for the Nazi killings in World War II. Milgram started his experiments in 1961, shortly after the trial of the World War II criminal Adolf Eichmann had begun. Eichmann's defense that he was merely following instructions when he ordered the deaths of millions of Jews roused Milgram's interest. In the study, the researchers had some participants give what they thought were dangerous electric shocks to another person, just because an authority figure told them to. The participants in the most famous variation of the Milgram experiment were 40 men recruited using newspaper ads. In exchange for their participation, each person was paid $4. Each person was assigned the role of teacher and would give an electric shock to the student in the next room every time they gave an incorrect answer. The teachers thought they were actually giving real shocks, but the students were all actors who were just pretending to get shocked. Milgram created this crazy shock machine. It started with 15 volts of shock and went up in 15-volt increments all the way to 450. The switches were all labeled with words like light shock, medium shock, and dang, severe shock. Then there were 3 last ones that were just marked with an ominous XXX. So the teacher asked the student questions, and when he gave the wrong answer, he punished him with a fake electric shock. As the experiment progressed, the participant would hear the learner plead to be released or even complain about a heart condition. Once they reached the 300-volt level, the learner would bang on the wall and demand to be released. After that, the learner went completely silent and wouldn't answer any more questions. So the experimenter told the person to treat the silence as a wrong answer and give them another shock. A lot of people asked the experimenter if they should keep going. The experimenter just gave them more commands to keep pushing them along. These commands were, please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice. You must go on. In the Milgram study, obedience was tested by how much shock the participants were willing to give. A lot of people got really upset, stressed out, and mad at the person giving the orders, but they still kept doing what they were told until the very end of the experiment. Milgram's study found that 65% of people in the experiment gave the maximum shock. Out of the 40 people in the study, 26 gave the most intense shocks, and 14 didn't go all the way to the highest level. The results showed that people can be really influenced by those in authority and can be very obedient. Bobo Doll Experiment. Between 1961 and 1963, Bandura did a bunch of experiments with the Bobo doll. Those experiments later became a big part of his social learning theory, which changed psychology from being all about behavior to also considering thoughts and feelings. Bandura, Ross, and Ross in 1961 did an experiment where they had kids watch an adult act violently towards a big funny-looking doll called a Bobo doll. These dolls were really popular in the 1960s and had a clown face on them. They were made to stand up by themselves when you pushed them over. The participants for the experiment were 36 boys and 36 girls enrolled at the Stanford University Nursery School. The children ranged in age between 3 and almost 6 years. The experiment had 2 groups of kids, each with 24 kids in them. One group was exposed to an adult who acted aggressively, and the other group was exposed to an adult who didn't act aggressively. The third group, which was also 24, was the control group. They weren't exposed to any adult behavior. In the non-violent condition, the grown-up model just played with the other toys in the experiment room and completely ignored the Bobo doll throughout the whole time. But in the aggressive condition, the adults would violently hit the Bobo doll. After the 10-minute interaction with the adult model, each kid was then taken to another room with a bunch of cool toys, like a dollhouse, a fire engine, and a toy plane. The kids were only allowed to play for 2 minutes, and then they had to stop playing with all those toys. It was all part of the plan to make them more frustrated. Poor kids. Finally, each kid was taken to the last room for the experiment. In that room, there were all sorts of aggro toys like a mallet and a tetherball with a face on it. There were also dart guns and, of course, the Bobo doll. But there were also some non-aggro toys like crayons and paper and dolls and plastic animals and trucks. Each kid was then given 20 minutes to play in the room. While they were playing, the researchers watched them through a one-way mirror to see how aggressive they were being. Bandura predicted a few things would happen in the Bobo doll experiment. Boys would be more aggressive than girls. If a kid saw an adult act aggressively, they'd be more likely to do it too, even if the adult wasn't there. Kids would imitate adults of the same gender more than those of the other gender. The kids who saw the non-aggressive model would be less likely to be aggressive, and the non-aggressive group would be less aggressive overall than the control group. The experiment kinda confirmed some of the initial predictions, but it also threw up some surprises. Overall, the boys were more likely to act violently than the girls, but the girls seemed more interested in sitting on the Bobo doll. The gender of the role model also mattered. Kids who watched a male role model were more likely to use aggressive gunplay. Even if the model wasn't using a gun, it also seemed that how appropriate the role model's actions were for their gender influenced whether the subject copied those actions. For instance, boys watching a female model were less likely to punch the Bobo doll and more likely to just sit on it. So social learning seems to depend on whether the child thinks the role model is doing something appropriate for their gender. There wasn't a strong connection between how aggressive the kids were before the experiment and how aggressive they were during it. Harlow's Pit of Despair. The experiment was created by an American psychologist, Harry Harlow, with the goal of creating an animal model for depression to better understand the condition and possibly find treatments. They took a rhesus monkey and put it in a tall, cone-shaped cage made of cold, hard steel. In this hole, the monkeys were fed and had water, but they were left alone for weeks at a time. Harlow called this device the Pit of Despair. He explained in a 1969 paper that the idea was inspired by the emotional state of someone with severe depression. He said, "People with depression say they feel like they're in the depths of despair, like they've sunk into a well of loneliness and hopelessness." So he built a device that would represent that feeling, and he called it the pit, or vertical chamber, because some people might find the word pit too negative. Most monkeys would just sit there, like a bunch of little statues, for days after they were put in that hole thingy. Once they were taken out, they didn't go back to normal. In a study Harlow did in 1971, he found that monkeys who were in that pit of despair for 30 days didn't play, avoided social interaction, and didn't show any curiosity. Most of them just stayed there, huddled up, holding their bodies with their hands. Those crazy behaviors, as Harlow called them, didn't change even after they got out of the hole. Harlow thought that the hole had a lot of potential for studying depression, but it's not clear if it really helped us understand clinical depression or how to treat it. To most people, Harlow's experiments were just plain cruel and wrong. According to American literary critic Wayne C. Booth, Harry Harlow and his colleagues go on torturing their non-human primates decade after decade, invariably proving what we all knew in advance, that social creatures can be destroyed by destroying their social ties. Some people have suggested that Harlow seemed to take pleasure in giving his creations vivid and intentionally shocking names. In addition to the Pit of Despair, he also created the Tunnel of Terror and the Iron Maiden, which is named after a real-life torture device. Sure, his experiments might not get past the uni's ethics board in the 21st century, but animal testing is still widely used in research. According to stats from the USDA, US scientists used 75,000 apes for research in 2018. The Gender Reassignment. In the mid-1960s, a psychologist named John Money helped change the gender of a boy named David Reimer. Money asserted gender was primarily learned, not innate. David was born with ordinary biological male traits, but as a baby, something went wrong during surgery and he lost them when he was 8 months old. David was born in 1965 and he had a twin brother. His parents got in touch with John Money, this psychologist who was working on a theory about gender neutrality. He had this idea that a kid would adopt the gender identity they were raised as rather than the one that matches their biological gender. After some encouragement from Money, Reimer's parents decided to raise him as a girl. When he was a baby, Reimer had surgery to create some basic female parts, and he was given female hormones when he went through puberty. They made him wear dresses and play with dolls, and they expected him to behave like a typical girl. During his childhood, Reimer wasn't told that he was actually a boy, and he regularly saw Money, who was tracking his progress with his gender stuff. Unknowingly, Reimer ended up being a guinea pig for Money's crazy research project, which he dubbed the John Joan case. John Money reported on Reimer's progress as the John Joan case to keep the identity of David anonymous. In the book Man and Woman, Boy and Girl Gender Identity from Conception to Maturity that was published in 1972, Money described David's transition as successful. He claimed that David behaved like a little girl and did not demonstrate any of the boyish mannerisms of his twin brother Brian. Money would publish this data to reinforce his theories on gender fluidity and to justify that gender identity is primarily learned. And of course, this data is a falsification, as we could see evidence from Reimer, which claimed that as a child, he experienced severe gender dysphoria, a condition in which someone experiences distress as a result of their assigned gender. Reimer reported that he did not identify as a girl and resented Money's visits for treatment. Walked heavy by peers in school for his masculine traits, Reimer claimed that despite receiving female hormones, wearing dresses, and having his interests directed toward typically female norms, he always felt that he was a boy. When David found out the truth about his true gender at the age of 15 from his dad, he decided to identify as a boy and started calling himself David. He underwent treatments to reverse the gender assignment, such as testosterone injections and surgeries to remove his female traits. David then married a woman named Jane at 22 years and adopted 3 children. David continued to suffer from psychological trauma throughout adulthood due to Money's experiments and his harrowing childhood experiences. David endured unemployment, the death of his twin brother Brian, and marital difficulties. At the age of 38, David was found dead. So, the book was published, right? And obviously, it led to consequences. It's needless to say about the reliability of a study with one test group on a sample of one person. It's just unprofessional. The public took the results of the study at face value, and I just couldn't believe it was real. People were so ignorant and uneducated that they began conducting experiments on their children with gender reassignment, like in the case of Reimer. It led to thousands of surgeries for kids with reproductive problems, and it is very sad. Thanks for watching. Click that like and subscribe button. It will help our channel to grow. In this video, I didn't manage to cover all the crazy psychology experiments because they're a bit too long to explain. If you want to see the second part, or if you know about any other crazy psychology experiments, please let me know in the comments. See you in the next one. Bye.